Hey all, Alex here at your home on the Music Deep Dive. And today it's time for a bit of a different video. We are at the beginning of 2025. And because of that, I thought it would be fun to do a little bit of a retrospective on some of the books that I have read and potentially even reviewed for this channel. So what we're going to do today is a little bit different. I'm going to count down the top 10 books that I read for this Music Deep Dive project in the year 2024. Now, I read and reviewed something along the lines of like 50 something books last year, which is a lot less than I wanted to. However, due in part to work travel and also the fact that some of these books were literally about 1,000 pages long, we didn't quite get to the goal that I had in mind, however lofty it might have been. So we're going to talk about kind of the 10 best books that I read this year. This is not the 10 best books that came out in 2024. There are a couple of 2024 books that I did read, but I do not believe, in fact, I can confirm that none of them are on this list. I also want to specify too, I am limiting this to books that I have read for the Music Deep Dive project, as it were. So because of that, there are a couple of books that I technically did read in 2024 that I'm not going to be including in this ranking here. One of these is going to be a book that I reviewed, which is Cocaine and Rhinestones by Tyler Mahan Coe. It is a terrific book, and I highly recommend it if you're interested in the history of George Jones and Tammy Wynette and 20th century country music. However, it was more of a read that I wanted to do for fun and my own personal enjoyment, not directly connected to this project, so I didn't feel quite that it was fair to rate it and rank it here. Since I was approaching it a little bit differently than I did some of these other books. And the other book that I did actually never reviewed on this channel that I'm not going to be including in this list is the book My Effin' Life by Geddy Lee, the autobiography of the Rush singer. I read that book kind of on a whim. Basically, I had like a free day and I needed to read something that wasn't related to the channel or anything like that, and so I decided to pick that up, and I ended up finishing it that same day because of that's how good it is. It's phenomenal. It's one of the best rock autobiographies that I've ever read. Highly recommend it if you're a Rush fan. If you're not a Rush fan, I think it's still worth reading. But ultimately, again, I was approaching it with kind of a different frame of mind than I have been these others. So I didn't feel entirely fair counting it as part of this ranking. But with that said, we have 10 books, so let's go ahead and count them down. And actually, really quick, before I do count the books down, I do want to bring up a couple of honorable mentions here. Adrian Desmond and James Moore's book on Darwin I thought was really great, just missed the list, barely. David S. Reynolds' biography of John Brown, abolitionist, was a strong contender for the list, just missed out as well. And then right at the bottom, literally coming in at the 11th position, Eric Larson's The Demon of Unrest. A phenomenal book on the kind of origin of the Civil War and really well written. And I think, again, it more so speaks to the quality of the 10 that I have above it, that this book is not quite making the list. I do also want to point out this is going to be a mixture of classic works and contemporary nonfiction works. In fact, I think it's almost an even mixture of both. So you're going to be getting some more current books and then some of the great classics that I had a chance to read as well. So with that said, let's get to number 10. Number 10, I have Nell Irvin Painter's Sojourner Truth, A Life, a Symbol, biography of the great anti-slavery activist Sojourner Truth. The reason that I really connected with this book in particular, I think, was, there's not a whole lot of written material that we know about Sojourner Truth as a person, as a woman, as a former slave, and as an activist. And yet I think what Painter does in this narrative is really kind of dig into that, try to dig into the truth of it, and also dig into how her image has kind of been distorted maybe over the years by people who are ultimately well-meaning, wanting to kind of enhance her image, but in the process end up distorting who the person Sojourner Truth actually was. And I think throughout all of this, you don't lose sight of who she is. throughout this narrative. Like, I think Painter does a really great job of keeping that front and center. And so because of that, it's certainly one of the best biographies that I read this year. I think it's a stellar bit of work on someone who certainly deserves a biography of this caliber written about her. And compared to the one, I read a biography of Harriet Tubman that I don't even think I reviewed on this channel because it was just kind of a non-entity. But yeah, this Sojourner Truth one, really spectacular, really well done. Check it out. Number 9, I have Charles Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal, The Flowers of Evil. I had to go back and review this one because I realized that I never actually did a review of this work on the channel. And this is certainly intentional. I have a bit of a difficult time justifying reviewing poetry on this channel. I already kind of think that I'm not necessarily qualified enough to review books on this channel, so reviewing poetry seems like just an extra step outside of my comfort zone, as it were. But there's no doubt that this Baudelaire work was one of the absolute best things that I read, certainly the best piece of poetry that I've read this year. It's a collection of different works that really I find just have this, it just creates this massive sweeping survey of the human condition, of what it means to be human in all the kind of, in all the best, most euphoric ways. It's a very sensual work, but also in ways that are either darker or sometimes even more mundane. I believe there's a couple of works there that are even written from the perspective of a cat that I think are often quoted by some of those like cat owner, cat lover Facebook pages or whatever. But really what it comes down to is just a lot of pieces that are very meditative, beautifully written, beautifully worded. I read the Richard Howard translation, which I think is one of the standards, if not the gold standard. And yeah, it's, again, people respond differently to poetry and especially to different types of poetry. I'm not going to say this is everybody's cup of tea, but I think there's an accessibility to this work that even a lot of other romantic poetry maybe doesn't necessarily have. And for that reason, I loved it. I think it was spectacular, and that's why it comes in at number 9. Number 8, I have Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. I am going to be, so there's a few Dickens novels that are going to be on this list, and I don't want to spoil too much because, one, I've made entire videos on pretty much all of these books, except for the last one I just talked about. Number 2, there will be a Dickens-specific ranking that will come out once I finish Our Mutual Friend, and maybe I'll finish Edwin Drood as well, just to cover all my bases. But what I'll say about A Tale of Two Cities is it's one of the darkest Dickens novels, but also in a way one of the most accessible, certainly from a length standpoint. It's one of his shortest classic novels, certainly. And really, I think there's a lot of historical value in this. Again, it's a historical novel, and I think it succeeds a lot better in that capacity than some of his other work that's geared in the same way. But I think it really works from a pacing standpoint. I think you were immersed in the setting without getting overwhelmed by the details. And I think there's always, like, you're on the edge of your seat kind of throughout, especially the back half of the book, the back part of the book. And I would wager that the ending of this one is possibly the best of any Dickens novel. That's a hard battle to fight. That's a hard thing to choose, but it would be up there for me. It's a phenomenal book, well worth it. Is it my pick for a starter Dickens novel? Hard to say, but it's a classic for a reason. You can't go wrong with it. Tale of Two Cities is my number 8. Number 7, I have James M. McPherson's Battlecry of Freedom, the Civil War era. Maybe some of this was just due to the fact that I had just spent the last month slogging through Shelby Foote's Civil War history, but this was such a breath of fresh air. I cannot overstate that. Really well done history. A lot of really good sort of intentional language about the origins of the war, about the overall kind of broader social consequences of what was going on and how it affected enslaved people at the time. while also, again, mixing in a lot of good like political discourse and a lot of good kind of military history as well. I mean, it balances everything so well with this modern, this real like contemporary perspective that seems like it could have been written a few years ago. And then when you look at the publishing date, you realize, oh, this thing came out in the late 80s. It genuinely seems like scholarship that is ahead of its time. And as a one volume history, it reads super well. It's just hard for me not to recommend this book for people looking to get into the Civil War and read about it in depth, but not to a point where it becomes overwhelming. I know there are other books that have come out sooner. I remember someone in the comments to that video, I believe, recommended the Alan Guelzo, if that's how you say his name. He wrote a book a few years ago that I understand is very well reviewed. I've not gotten to that yet. But this McPherson book, even for its relative age, still holds up pretty damn well. So it comes in at my number 7. If you're looking for Civil War histories, that's probably about as good as it gets. Number 6, I have Gustave Flaubert with Madame Bovary. I said a lot about this book. I said pretty much all that I wanted to say about it in the actual review of it. But, for being a romance novel and for being something that is marketed as a romance novel and as a tragic story, there's certainly a tragedy to it. But it feels like not a satirization of romance novels, but it feels like a romance novel interpreted through the lens of someone writing a psychological thriller. It's disturbing as hell. And it's so filled with paranoia and darkness and sin, I guess. And you never really, at least from my perspective, again, you don't necessarily get the sense that the main character is someone who you are supposed to empathize with. She's someone who is supposed to be pitied, if anything. And I think the way that Flaubert does it, I think he writes it without minimizing the main character and belittling her, but I think he writes it in almost like a way to make it a cautionary tale. Like, you could fall, like any of us could fall into that same line of thinking and completely destroy all of the good things that we have if we're not careful. And that is fascinating. I think if we're talking about books that surprised me the most, I was not prepared for all of what this book was going to make me feel and contemplate when I read it. And certainly if we're talking about best novels from this era, best novel from the 1850s, Madame Bovary is right up there. Stellar work. Check it out if you haven't. Number 5, I have Charles Dickens with Great Expectations. Really a phenomenal novel. One I was familiar with going in. Definitely one of the darkest things that he's ever written. Certainly at least isolated moments, I think, are incredibly grim to the point of being straight out of like an early horror novel or something. But mixed with just some beautiful scenes, some of the best character writing I think he's ever done. And again, some really touching pieces scattered throughout, but again, especially towards the ending, like just some gut-wrenching scenes. Again, will it, how high will it rank as far as my general Dickens list? I don't know. It's possible this could change when I sit down and try to compile it properly. But there's no doubt this has some of the best moments of any Dickens novel. There's no doubt that for me, I think this is one of his most complete pieces that he ever wrote. And, I think this is really the last true classic novel that Dickens put out, which is not me making any sort of judgment of quality on Our Mutual Friend or Edwin Drood or anything, just thinking about popular perception here. But yeah, really powerful, really well done novel. If it's not his best, it's right up there. And right now I have it at number 5 here. And at least on this list, it comes in at his second best because he has another one coming up right after this. Number 4, as I mentioned before, I have Dickens yet again, this time with David Copperfield. Again, if this will be in the final order of my Dickens list, I don't really know, but I will say that between this, Great Expectations, and Tale of Two Cities, very possibly the three best Dickens novels. It's kind of hard to say. There's some other contenders for sure, but they're definitely up there. David Copperfield, to me, I think, stands out, especially in relation to everything else he was doing. The 1840s are such a kind of dry period for Dickens where I don't really love most of the novels that came out during that period. I think a lot of them were very much like trying to make ends meet. But David Copperfield, here there's an ambition. There's a real sense of not just scope here, but a real sense of intimacy, I think. You know, this is definitely Dickens writing about himself to some extent, and I think that comes across. And I think because of that, it has some of the most three-dimensional character writing that he's placed into any novel of his. Even the antagonists, I think, are really well written. And even though I think like he will have other novels that are more massive than this and are trying to do more different things, Bleak House comes to mind, for instance, I think Copperfield has the heart and has the strength of characters to stick that landing better than almost anything else. So you combine all these pieces with, again, some really well done, well written characters, really sympathetic figures, a lot of them. And there's no doubt it's a career highlight for him. So for the time being, it comes in at number 4 on my overall list, and we'll see where it lands in the Dickens list. Number 3, I have Solomon Northrup with 12 Years a Slave. I mean, again, it's hard to really like put a slave narrative in a ranking like this, so don't overthink me putting it at number 3 or only number 3 or what have you. I understand this is a tough thing to rank, but if we're talking about just as a piece of literature, as a piece of compelling writing, goddamn, this thing is powerful. And again, it's unique compared to other slave narratives in the sense that for many of the folks who wrote those narratives, these were people who were born into slavery. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery, right? In this case, you know, this came out after the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act, which was a huge deal in the United States, caused a huge uproar. And this story of a man who was, you know, a free man, living in freedom in the Northeast, who was literally captured and sold into slavery, and lived through absolute hell, people abusing him and trying to break him both physically and mentally. It really gives such a horrifying but, you know, crystal clear perspective of just how deep the horrors of slavery, how deep they lay within, and how many layers of horror and torture were required to keep this system afloat. And, you know, for as much as you can credit something like Uncle Tom's Cabin for shedding a light on these issues, which it certainly did, even if I didn't love the actual novel and I don't have it on this list, I can acknowledge that. You have to pair that with actual, tangible, real-life stories. And certainly Frederick Douglass's narrative has an impact, but this one has a hell of an impact too. And I cannot imagine how many people it radicalized after publication. Powerful read. Again, prepare yourself when you do read this, because it's a lot, but a necessary one to understand pretty much anything about this time. 12 Years a Slave. Check it out. Number 2, I have Doris Kearns Goodwin with Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln. I just reviewed this like a month ago. It's a book that I have read a couple times now, and still just the achievement here, how well this whole story is told, is nothing short of amazing to me. It is very much it's a cinematic story in and of itself. Like anything related to Lincoln has that air of grandeur alongside it that you can't help but be, kind of swept into. But Goodwin's framing here is so spectacular, and understanding not just how important of a man he is, like there's no doubt he rises above everybody here, but how much he was shaped by all these people who were close to him, all these people who in some ways differed from him pretty massively, it's so well done. The writing is stellar. The writing is crisp. It's very visual. And it's just an absolute joy to read. So again, for people who have checked out the Spielberg film Lincoln, nothing against it. It's a great film. But make sure you read the book too, because there's so much I think you get in the book that you don't get in the film. And it's a book that's so well written that I have sitting on my shelves biographies of each of the figures involved in this story because I'm curious to read more about them. So expect reviews for those at some point. Maybe not soon, but eventually down the line. Team of Rivals is stellar. Nothing more to say about it. It comes in at number 2. And number 1, because honestly, it probably couldn't be anything else after finishing it so recently and thinking so highly of it. Victor Hugo, Les Miserables. Just a phenomenal narrative. It's one of the most complex novels that I've had the pleasure of reading. And there's so much going on. There's so much historical information that Hugo wants you to know, so many thoughts that he has, so many opinions. And even though, like, especially if you're reading the unedited version, it can be a little bit, daunting to tackle that, it's worth it in service of the story. And the story here is about as good as you will find. A story that contains class struggle. It contains, spiritual rebirth, spiritual atonement, and just this general theme of reinventing oneself, what heroism means, what it means to value your country, what it means to value human life. There's so much going on here. I mean, it could not be more obviously a magnum opus if it tried. It would be a magnum opus for any writer on the face of the earth, pretty much. And the fact that it is the case for Hugo, someone who is as acclaimed as he is, says something. Jean Valjean, I think, is one of the best characters in literature that I've had the pleasure of coming across so far. So much complexity to him. Such a great arc. And yeah, I mean, again, there's nothing I can say here that I didn't already talk about in the review of it, which you can watch if you go back in my channel and look at the history. Yeah, it's Les Miserables. It's as good as people say. Go read it. If you want to, watch the damn musical and then read the book. That's fine. But please read the book. Please read the book. It's my number 1. Okay, and that is it. We have gone through the top 10 books, like I said, that I have read in the year 2024. I'm really excited for 2025. I'm already 3 books in as of this recording, and already we've got some books that are going to be looking at a high place on next year's list. So let me know in the comments below what books you read in 2024. What were some of your favorites? They could be books that came out in 2024. They could be books that came out in 1824. I don't care. I'm just curious to know what you read last year, what you hope to read next year maybe, what are some of your most anticipated books, again, ones that will come out next year, or just ones that you have on your shelf and you want to get to reading. I would love to hear about it, and I love recommendations too. I have literally hundreds of books, if not thousands, on my to-read list, so I can't promise I'll get to any of them, but any recommendations you have, please let me know. I'm always happy to take them. With that, I want to thank you all so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.